I house sat for a colleague named Diane for 11 days while she attended a family event out of state. Diane was organized in the particular way that detail-oriented people are. She had left me a typed instruction sheet, 2 pages, covering everything from the thermostat settings to which burner on the stove ran hot. She'd shown me the house twice before she left. I knew where the spare key lived, how to reset the Wi-Fi router, and that the neighbor to the east, an older man named Mr. Pratt, sometimes knocked if he saw an unfamiliar car in the driveway. The house was a craftsman-style 2-story in a quiet residential neighborhood. Mature trees in the yard, a detached garage, a screened back porch that looked out onto a narrow strip of garden. Diane had lived there alone for years, and the house had her particular personality embedded in it. Tidy, considered, nothing out of place. I arrived on a Sunday afternoon. I walked through the house using her instruction sheet as a guide, checked all the windows as she'd asked, tested the locks. Everything was in order. I settled in, made dinner, and spent a comfortable first evening reading on the back porch. The first thing I noticed was on Tuesday. Diane's instruction sheet had a line about the basement. The chest freezer runs, ignore the hum. The basement door sticks, pull hard. She kept a separate freezer down there for bulk storage, apparently. Standard enough. On Tuesday evening, I heard the hum she'd mentioned, but it wasn't the low, steady drone of a running appliance. It was intermittent. On for a few seconds, then off, then on again, an irregular rhythm. I stood at the top of the basement stairs and listened. The cycle cycled a few more times and then settled into a normal, continuous tone. Old appliance, I told myself. They cycle irregularly sometimes, especially in fluctuating temperatures. I didn't go downstairs. I went back to what I was doing. On Thursday night, I woke at just past 2 to a sound I couldn't place. Not the freezer hum, something different. A faint, low creak somewhere below me that repeated twice and then stopped. I lay still and listened for several minutes. The house was silent. I checked the main floor. Nothing was disturbed. The back door was locked. The front door was locked and bolted. I stood in the kitchen for a while, feeling slightly foolish, and then went back to bed. Friday was when I found the basement door open. Not wide open, about 4 inches. I stood in the hallway looking at it for a long moment. Diane's instructions had said the door sticks, pull hard. If anything, a sticking door would be harder to open accidentally, not easier. And I hadn't opened it. I had no reason to go down there. I pulled it fully open and stood at the top of the stairs looking down. The basement light was controlled by a pull string at the bottom. I couldn't see anything in the dark below. I stood there long enough to feel the cold air rising from below, and then I closed the door and went to call Diane. She didn't answer. Time difference, likely, sleeping. I left a message. She called back that afternoon. I described what I'd found. There was a pause on her end before she spoke. She asked me if I'd checked the basement windows. I hadn't. She said there were 2 small ground-level windows on the north side of the house. Old single latch mechanisms she'd been needing to replace. She asked me to go down and check them. I took a flashlight and went. The basement was a standard utility space. Concrete floor, water heater, the chest freezer running steadily in the corner. I found the 2 windows. One was latched, the other was not. The latch was in the open position, and the window itself was seated in the frame but not secured. On the floor below that window, there was a faint smear of mud. I photographed it, left the basement, and relocked the basement door. Then I called the non-emergency line and had an officer come out. He checked the window, noted the mud, walked the yard, checked the garage. He didn't find anyone present, but he agreed the window should be secured and suggested I stay somewhere else for the remaining nights if I was uncomfortable. I called Diane back. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that I've thought about often since. She said the basement window had been latched when she left. She was certain of it because she'd gone through the entire house specifically before the trip, and she'd checked every window. She came home 2 days early. The window latch was handled. The mud was never fully explained. Whether someone had used that window to come in and whether the sounds I'd heard were connected remained an open question. I've house sat exactly once since then. I checked the basement first.
The arrangement came through a mutual connection, a friend of a friend who needed someone reliable for an extended stay. The owners, a couple named the FAIRBURNs, were spending 6 weeks abroad and wanted the house occupied rather than empty. They were willing to pay a modest stipend. I was between apartments at the time. It seemed like good timing for everyone. The FAIRBURN house sat at the end of a private road about 2 miles outside a small town in the interior of the state. Heavily wooded property, a long gravel driveway, a 2-story house with a wraparound porch and more rooms than I needed. The nearest neighbor was a farmhouse barely visible through the trees. The nearest town was 15 minutes. It was the kind of isolation that sounds appealing in theory and is, in practice, genuinely quiet in both the good and the complicated sense of that word. Mrs. FAIRBURN had given me a thorough walkthrough before they left. She was warm and organized and showed me everything with the attentiveness of someone who genuinely loved her home. One thing she mentioned near the end of the tour stayed with me slightly, though I didn't dwell on it at the time. She said that occasionally, very occasionally, she thought she heard footsteps on the porch at night. She believed it was deer coming up to the lower garden beds. She said this matter-of-factly, with a small smile, and moved on. I settled in. The first week was genuinely pleasant. I worked remotely, took long walks on the property in the afternoons, slept well. The isolation that I had anticipated might feel oppressive felt instead like relief. In the second week, I heard the porch footsteps. It was a Wednesday, just after midnight. I was still awake, reading in the sitting room, which looked out onto the front porch through a wide window. The porch light was on a motion sensor. It had triggered once or twice for what I had assumed was wildlife. When it triggered this time, I looked up at the window. The porch was lit and empty. Then I heard the footstep. One, deliberate, from the right side of the porch toward the front door. I put my book down and sat very still. The porch light stayed on for its timed duration, then clicked off. In the dark that followed, I heard nothing more. I didn't go to the door. I turned on the interior lights in the entry hallway and sat in the sitting room until my heart settled, then went to bed with the hall light on. Mrs. FAIRBURN had said deer. I tried to let that hold. But over the following week and a half, the footsteps returned 4 more times, always between 11 and 2, never more than 2 or 3 steps. The motion light would trigger, sometimes without a sound following, and once I heard the footsteps without the light triggering at all, which meant whatever made them was moving slowly enough to avoid breaking the sensor threshold. Deer are not careful. Deer are not careful. I started leaving the porch light on manually at night, so the motion sensor became irrelevant. I also began keeping a specific log: time, what I heard, whether the sensor triggered. On a Friday night in week 3, I was in the upstairs hallway when I heard something new. Not the porch, the back of the house. A single knock on the back door, low and deliberate. Not urgent, not the way a person knocks when they need help. Measured. I stood at the top of the stairs and listened. Silence. Then, perhaps 40 seconds, one more knock. Same rhythm, same tone. I called the friend who'd arranged the house sit. I described everything I'd logged. She listened carefully and told me to call the owners, which I'd been hesitant to do during their trip. I called Mr. FAIRBURN. He listened without interruption. When I finished, he asked me one specific question. Had I checked whether the garden shed behind the house was locked? I hadn't known there was a garden shed.
He told me it was set back in the tree line about 80 feet from the house, and yes, it should have a padlock on it. I did not go out to check at that hour. In the morning, with full daylight, I walked back to the tree line and found the shed. The padlock was present, but not closed. It was sitting in the latch, unfastened. Inside the shed, a folded tarp that wasn't folded the way someone who lives there would fold it. It was folded quickly, stuffed rather than stored. A partial bag of crackers, a small handheld radio with the batteries removed, sitting separately beside it. The Fairburns cut their trip short by a week. Mr. Fairburn had a strong suspicion about who might be responsible, a former maintenance worker who'd had a dispute with them the previous year, but I was never confirmed on the outcome of that. I stayed in a motel in town for the final 4 nights and checked on the house each morning. The shed was padlocked properly, the porch was quiet. What I think about now is Mrs. Fairburn's casual mention of the footsteps. She'd heard them. She'd attributed them to deer. Had she heard them for months? Had the shed been used before? I never asked her directly. I think, in hindsight, I was afraid of what a fully honest answer might be.
I want to tell this one carefully, because the element that frightened me most is something I've told only a few people, and each time I've told it, I've watched the other person's expression do the same thing. A slow shift from polite listening to something more uncomfortable. I was house-sitting for a couple, friends from my early 20s who'd moved to a quiet, semi-rural community about 40 minutes from the city. They had a young child and were taking their first real vacation since the birth. 10 days, a warm weather destination, well-deserved. I had stayed with them before as a guest. I knew the house reasonably well. The house was the kind of home that accumulates meaning over time. It wasn't large, but it was full. Books, plants, art, and along the main hallway, a large gallery wall of framed photographs. Family photos, mostly. Candid shots, a few formal ones. Their wedding photos at the end nearest the kitchen. The kind of wall you walk past 20 times a day without examining closely. I arrived on a Saturday. They left before noon. I had a good first few days. I tended the plants as instructed, kept the house clean, enjoyed the quiet. On the 4th evening, I was walking down the hallway toward the kitchen when I stopped at the gallery wall. I'm not entirely sure what made me look closely. Some peripheral detail, maybe. But I stood in front of the photographs and looked at them, really looked at them, and noticed something. There was a photograph I didn't recognize. It was a 5x7, framed in a simple dark frame that matched 2 others on the wall. It showed the exterior of the house, the front of it, from the street. The porch light was off in the image, which meant it had been taken in daylight. The garden in the photo was in summer growth, consistent with the current season. I didn't recognize it as a photo my friends had ever shown me. It looked like the kind of image taken on a phone, not a composed shot, more of a document, a record. I stood in front of it for a very long time. I called my friend Lara that evening. She answered after 2 rings. I described the photograph, its position on the wall, the frame, the image itself. There was a long silence. Then she said, slowly, that she didn't own a photograph like that. She said they had never hung a photo of the exterior of the house. She asked me to take it down carefully and put it somewhere secure and not to touch the frame more than necessary. Her voice was steady, in the way people's voices are when they are working to sound steady. I took the photograph down and placed it in a kitchen drawer without touching the glass.
I then walked through the entire house with a level of attention I hadn't applied before, checking every window, every door, every space that someone could occupy or access. Everything was locked and intact. I called the non-emergency line and explained what I'd found. An officer came out that night. He walked through the house with me, examined the photograph without disturbing it, and took it into evidence, which he explained was a precautionary measure given the nature of it. He couldn't tell me at that point how long it had been there, whether it had been placed before my friends left or during the first 4 days of my stay. I couldn't tell him either. I'd walked that hallway every day and hadn't noticed it until the 4th evening. Someone had either placed it before Lara and her family left without their knowledge, or had come into the house during those 4 days. Neither option was comfortable. Lara and her husband came home early. The locks were changed. The framed photograph was examined further by someone with appropriate expertise, though I was never made fully aware of the outcome. Lara told me a few months later that they'd had some idea of who might be responsible, a situation that predated my house sit and that they thought had resolved itself, but she was careful about the details she shared. What I've turned over many times since is the photograph itself. It was a specific choice, not something left to frighten immediately, not something loud or obvious. It was a document, a way of saying, I know where this house is. I have stood outside it. I have been paying attention. It was placed in a gallery of family photographs, among the faces of people the homeowners loved, and it hung there in the middle of all that ordinary warmth until someone finally looked closely enough to notice it didn't belong.